want to remind you of one of the most popular fable stories, the story of the Little Red Hen. Remember her? One day she was pecking around the barnyard and found a piece of wheat. And she asked her barnyard friends, "Who will help me plant the wheat?" Well, no one was willing to plant that seed with her, so she did it herself. Eventually it grew, matured, and it was time to harvest the wheat. Who will help me harvest it? Well, again, no one was interested. They were all too lazy and focused on their own lives. Then she asked, "Who will help me grind the wheat into flour?" Again, no takers. "Who will help me bake the bread?" And of course, by this time, the bread is rising in the oven. Smell, beautiful aroma is pervading the farmyard. Now all the animals are interested in the Little Red Hen and her employments. "Who will help me eat the bread?" Suddenly everyone wanted to help. Of course, she answered, "I will eat it myself, for I did all the work myself." The animals were miserable as a result, as they were hungry watching her have the enjoyment of eating all the bread. What led to their misery? Well, the fact that they had made some really poor choices. And that leads to Christian myth number 5 that we're talking about today. It's this: I'm suffering because in some ways I messed up. Sometimes it's tempting for us as Christians to think that the reason we're suffering is because, like those barnyard animals, we made really bad choices. Now, how did we come to that conclusion? Why would we think that way? Well, because, like the Little Red Hen story tells us, sometimes our misery has been the result of our own poor choices. And the Bible itself teaches that. Think about Proverbs 22:3. It says, "The prudent sees danger and hides himself, but the simple goes on and suffers for it." In other words, we reap what we sow. Or think about Luke 15, the parable of the prodigal son. Even though that story ends really well with a beautiful picture of God and His grace, the reason that boy ends up in misery in a far country eating the pods that are thrown to pigs is because earlier in the story he made terrible choices to leave his father's good home, to abandon it, to take the inheritance before his father was dead, and to spend it in terrible ways. So we often do suffer because of our own bad choices. But is that the only reason we suffer? Should we automatically conclude the reason we're suffering is because we've messed up in some way? No. There are all kinds of other reasons why suffering comes into our lives. Think, for instance, about the fact that we live in a fallen world. We no longer live in the Garden of Eden. We no longer live in paradise. We live on this side of Genesis 3 instead of the Genesis 1 and 2 side before sin came into the world. I want you to think about Uriah the Hittite. He was the husband of Bathsheba, the woman who eventually became King David's wife. Of course, you probably know the story in 2 Samuel of David's seduction of Bathsheba and of how he tried to cover up that seduction by setting up a battle in a way that would ensure Uriah's quick death. Talk about suffering. Uriah lost his life. Why? Because he had messed up in some way? No, he had not done anything wrong. In fact, in that story, he proves himself to be a much more righteous person than King David. And yet he suffered tremendously. Why? Simply because he lived, like we do, in a fallen world. There's another reason why we suffer, and that's because we're in God's spiritual gym as His people. Something I like to say is, we never grow in the lazy boy. We grow in the gym of life. And God, in grace, often challenges us by bringing not times of ease, but times of challenge, suffering, into our lives to strengthen us. If you go into a gym, you're not going to grow, you're not going to get stronger by cashing out in a lazy boy and eating chips and watching ESPN. You're going to get stronger by being taken under the wing of a trainer who will drive you, who will challenge your body to go beyond what you thought it could do, so that your muscles strengthen, so that your body becomes much more healthy. And sometimes God sets up the circumstances of our lives to do exactly that, to challenge us, to change us. Think about Job. Of According to Job chapter 1, Job was one of the most godly men on earth when it was written. He was a man who loved the Lord. He loved his children. He prayed for his children every day, interceding for them. And yet he suffered tremendously. All 10 of his children died. He lost his livestock. Even his wife turned on him. She said, "Why don't you curse God and die?" Everything in Job's wonderful life had become suffering and misery. Why? Not because he had done anything wrong at all. And at the end of the story, we find out that even though Job really wants to know why God brought all that misery his way or allowed it, God gives him no answer. God owes him no answer. But the big point we find by the end of the story is that Job's trust in God was increased. And that's what God's up to in bringing suffering and misery and challenge our way as well. It's always an opportunity for us to grow spiritually stronger, to trust him in ways that we haven't had to in the past. There's a third reason why sometimes we suffer, and that is that God is using our suffering, our challenge, in order to impact someone else's life, someone that we may know nothing about, someone we may not have even met, someone who may not have yet even been born. A good example of that from church history comes when R.G. Letourneau, a man who would go on to be the greatest Christian philanthropist in American history, was an impoverished young man. He'd just been released from service in the Navy during World War I, and then he formed a partnership with a friend to establish an auto dealership. But little did he know that though he was investing his money in this auto dealership, it was financially tanking because his friend turned out to be an alcoholic who wasted all of the funds of the company. Eventually they went belly up, and Letourneau had to declare bankruptcy. And his immediate thought was, "Why, God? What did I do wrong?" Well, he hadn't done anything wrong. But the next job that he was able to get was leveling a piece of land owned by a rancher in Texas. Not only did he enjoy doing that, but he ended up inventing some equipment to make the job even easier. What had always been done by hand with men and shovels, now he came up with a way to do it with machines. And R.G. Letourneau would go on to be the largest developer of earth-moving equipment our nation has ever seen. He became incredibly wealthy as a result. He made a commitment to give 90% of his income to the Lord. Most of us think about giving 10%. He decided to live on 10% and give to the Lord 90%. And from that 90% has come so much good for the gospel in the world, including the establishment of Letourneau University in Longview, Texas. Last summer, a student named Macy had an opportunity through Letourneau University to spend the summer in Uganda working at an orphanage. As she worked with those orphans who had heartbreaking stories of being abandoned by their parents, she was able to show them the love of Christ that had been shown her through Letourneau University. Little could R.G. Letourneau have known decades ago the impact that he would have through the wealth he made because of a point of extreme suffering in his life. Why had he suffered? He didn't know. He wondered, did I do something wrong, Lord? Did I mess up? No, he didn't mess up at all. God was in it all, doing something for the future, for his kingdom, that Letourneau at the time knew nothing about. All of us suffer. All of us endure times of adversity, but as Christians we can always know that the most challenging times are never by mistake. Through them our great God is up to something wonderful, to make us more like his Son, to advance his kingdom, to glorify his name.